The first time Ranger failed to stand, the room went silent, not because the dog was weak, but because everyone could see he still wanted to fight. His back legs were gone, his mission was over, and the doctors had already chosen mercy. But Mason Carter heard something louder than the verdict: the heartbeat of a partner who had once saved him from the dark. So, when the world prepared to say goodbye, one Navy SEAL began building a miracle with his own hands. Before we begin, comment the city you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories of loyalty, courage, and miracles. Winter mist drifted over Coronado before dawn, carrying salt from the Pacific and cold rain across the training grounds like a gray curtain pulled between the world and mercy. Mason Carter moved through that morning fog with the quiet precision of a man who had learned long ago that hesitation could cost lives. He was 36, tall and broad-shouldered, with a hard, athletic frame shaped by years inside the Navy SEAL teams. His dark brown hair was cut short, military neat, and his clean-shaven jaw gave his face a severe, almost carved look. But his eyes told a different story. They were gray-blue, calm on the surface, yet shadowed by things he rarely spoke about: missions that ended with empty seats, names folded into flags, and one friend he still heard in his dreams whenever the rain came hard enough. To the younger men on base, Mason was discipline itself. To those who knew him better, he was a man who carried grief like a second uniform, buttoned tight and never taken off. At his left side walked Ranger, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a deep black and tan coat, a powerful chest, alert amber eyes, and ears that seemed to catch every whisper in the wind. Ranger was not just fast, he was exact. He could track a scent through wet sand, smoke, oil, and panic. He had the patience of an old soldier and the heart of a creature who believed Mason's silence was a language worth answering. Around other handlers, Ranger was obedient. Around Mason, he was something more ancient and sacred: a guardian, a brother, the four-legged shadow that had followed him out of nightmares more than once. The training field that morning had been built to resemble a collapsed urban site: broken concrete walls, steel panels, narrow alleys, hanging tarps, and puddles collecting beneath the rain. A few SEAL trainees watched from the edge of the course, their helmets dark with water. Among them stood Ben Turner, Mason's closest teammate, a 38-year-old SEAL with a shaved head, square shoulders, light brown skin, and a short beard trimmed close to his jaw. Ben was the kind of man who joked before danger and prayed after it, though he would deny both if asked. He had seen Mason return from war quieter than before, and he knew Ranger had done what no counselor, chaplain, or bottle of pills had managed to do: bring Mason back into the present, one morning at a time. "Send him when ready," the instructor called from the observation platform. Mason crouched beside Ranger and placed one gloved hand against the dog's neck. Beneath the wet fur, he felt the steady beat of life, brave and eager. Ranger's muscles trembled with focus, not fear. Mason looked into those amber eyes and felt the strange ache he always felt before a run: pride mixed with trust mixed with the terror of loving something that could be lost. Then he gave the signal. Ranger shot forward through the rain like a black and gold arrow. He cleared the first barrier, slid beneath a hanging beam, paused once to catch the scent trail, then turned sharply toward the far side of the course where a mock casualty had been hidden beneath a concrete slab. Every movement was beautiful in the way only trained purpose could be beautiful. Mason followed at a distance, his boots striking water, his focus locked on the dog. Then the course betrayed them. Ranger crossed a slick steel plate half hidden beneath mud and rainwater. It shifted. A flat, ugly crack rang out as the metal kicked loose under his weight. Ranger tried to correct, claws scraping for grip, body twisting mid-stride. For one suspended second, Mason saw the whole world narrow into the shape of his dog falling. Then Ranger hit the concrete hard. The sound was not loud, but it was final, dry, and terrible, like a branch snapping in an empty church. The field went silent. Ranger lifted his head at once, stubborn even in shock. His front paws clawed against the wet ground. He tried to rise, tried again, then again, but his back legs dragged behind him as if they belonged to some other creature. Confusion flashed across his face, more painful than fear. He looked down at his own body, then up at Mason, ears twitching, eyes wide with a question no command could answer. Mason ran. He dropped to his knees beside Ranger so hard the water splashed up around them. His hands moved over the dog's ribs, spine, hips, searching, praying, refusing to understand what his fingers already feared. Ranger panted softly, still trying to push himself upright, still trying to be useful, still trying to obey. Mason pressed his forehead against the dog's damp neck, and for the first time that morning, the legendary steadiness in him cracked. Around them, no one spoke. Even the rain seemed to fall more quietly. Ranger was not afraid. That was what broke Mason most. The dog's eyes held only bewilderment and trust, the look of a warrior whose spirit was still standing while his body lay broken beneath him. The emergency cart rattled across the wet concrete as Mason ran beside it, one hand pressed against Ranger's shoulder as if touch alone could keep the dog anchored to life. Rainwater streaked down Mason's face, but he did not blink, did not speak, did not even seem to breathe unless Ranger breathed first. The German shepherd lay on his side atop the padded stretcher, his black and tan coat soaked dark, his powerful chest rising in uneven pulls. His front paws twitched every few seconds, still searching for ground, still trying to perform the duty his body had been trained for, but his back legs dragged limp behind him, too still, too quiet, like a message no one in that corridor wanted to read. Ben Turner followed close behind, his usually quick mouth silent now. He had seen men carried this way before, had heard boots slapping floors, radios cracking, someone yelling for pressure, someone else praying without knowing it. But seeing Ranger there felt different, almost wrong, as if loyalty itself had been wounded and no field manual knew how to treat it. The base veterinary unit sat low against the edge of the training compound, a white concrete building smelling of antiseptic, wet canvas, and fear carefully hidden beneath discipline. Waiting inside was Dr. Laura Mitchell, the senior military veterinarian, a 44-year-old woman with a lean, upright posture, pale skin lightly freckled from years working outdoor canine evaluations, and dark auburn hair pulled into a tight knot at the back of her head. Her eyes were green, steady, and kind in a way that never softened the truth. People on base respected her because she did not waste words, not with handlers, not with officers, not with grief. Years earlier, she had lost a working dog under her care after a blast injury overseas, and since then she had carried a quiet rule inside herself. Hope was allowed, but false hope was cruelty wearing perfume. "Move him carefully," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through panic. Mason stepped aside only because Ranger needed him to. Technicians slid the dog onto the examination table, and Dr. Laura began working with calm hands, checking pupils, pulse, breathing, pain response, spinal alignment, reflexes. Ranger turned his head toward Mason whenever he could, amber eyes tracking him across the room. That was what made it unbearable. He was present. He was aware. He was still Ranger. Mason stood at the edge of the table with his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. In his mind he kept hearing the fall, that dry crack against concrete, again and again, as if memory had become a cruel instructor forcing repetition until the lesson broke him. Ben moved closer and placed one hand on Mason's shoulder. "He's tough," Ben said quietly, but even he heard how thin the words sounded. Dr. Laura ordered imaging. The next hour passed in fragments. Ranger being lifted, Mason being told to wait behind the line, the cold glow of monitors, the whisper of technicians, the soft whine Ranger made only once when they adjusted him. Mason had endured briefings before raids, casualty reports, hostile fire, long nights where every shadow looked like an enemy. None of it had prepared him for standing outside a veterinary imaging room, helpless, staring at a closed door while the one creature who trusted him most lay beyond it. When Dr. Laura finally returned, she carried a tablet in one hand and the weight of bad news in her face. She did not speak at first. She led Mason and Ben into a small consultation room where the fluorescent light made everyone look older. The images appeared on the screen in pale gray layers: bone, shadow, damage. Dr. Laura pointed with one finger. "The trauma is here," she said. "There's significant swelling around the spinal cord. I'm also concerned about compression affecting nerve communication to the hind limbs." Mason stared at the screen, trying to translate the shapes into something he could fight. "Can he walk again?" he asked. Dr. Laura inhaled slowly. "Right now, he has almost no meaningful response in either rear leg. There is minimal reflex activity, but not enough for me to call it functional. If the swelling increases, the damage may become irreversible." Ben looked down. Mason did not. "But if it decreases?" "Then we watch for signs," she said, and there was mercy in how carefully she chose each word. "Small ones: pain response, muscle tone, voluntary movement, anything that tells us the nerves are still communicating." Mason nodded once as if receiving a mission brief, but Dr. Laura's face hardened with the part she hated most. "Mason, I need you to understand something. A dog ranger's size cannot lie immobile for long without serious consequences. Muscle wasting can begin quickly. Pressure sores, circulation problems, bladder complications, infection, pain. If he cannot regain any neurological function, keeping him alive may become suffering, not treatment." The words entered Mason like cold water through cracked armor. Ben's hand tightened on his shoulder. "What are you saying?" Mason asked, though he already knew. Dr. Laura held his gaze. "I'm saying we give him 72 hours. We treat swelling, manage pain, keep him stable, and watch for any sign that his body is still fighting. If there is nothing, then we talk about the humane decision." Humane. The word floated in the room like a blade wrapped in cloth. Mason turned away before anyone could see what moved across his face. Through the glass panel, he could see Ranger lying on a thick recovery pad, head lifted weakly, ears half raised at the sound of Mason's voice. The dog should have been sleeping from medication, but he was watching the door, always watching for Mason. Ben spoke softly. "Brother, you know I love that dog too, but if Laura says it's bad, it's bad. You may have to prepare yourself." Mason looked at him then, and for a moment Ben saw not stubbornness but terror, not fear of death. Mason had made peace with death too many times. This was fear of betrayal, fear of being asked to prove his love by letting go. That night, after the others left and the building settled into a hollow quiet, Mason stayed on the floor beside Ranger's pad. Machines hummed in gentle rhythm. Rain tapped the windows. Ranger's breathing was shallow but steady, each breath a small treaty with the dark. Mason rested one hand on the dog's neck and let his mind fall backward to a motel room 2 years earlier, after a mission that had gone wrong in a country he still never named. He had woken at 3:17 a.m., unable to breathe, sweat cold on his spine, one hand reaching for a rifle that was not there. The walls had seemed too close, the air too thin, the dead too near. Then Ranger, still young then, had climbed onto the bed without permission, pressed his full weight across Mason's chest and stayed there until Mason's breathing slowed. No command, no training cue, just instinct, loyalty, and a dog's strange, ancient wisdom. Ranger had pulled him back from a place no one else could reach. Now the same dog lay broken beneath sterile lights, and everyone was asking Mason to accept the verdict before the 72 hours had even begun. Mason leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching Ranger's. "You stayed with me," he whispered. Ranger's eyes shifted toward him, tired but trusting. Mason swallowed the grief burning in his throat. "So, I'm staying with you." Outside, the rain kept falling over Coronado, washing the training field clean of blood, mud, and pride. Inside, beside the wounded body of his four-legged teammate, Mason Carter made the only vow that still mattered. Navy SEALs did not leave their brothers behind, not on foreign soil, not in fire. Not in darkness, and not here, not Ranger, not while one breath remained between them. By the second morning, Mason Carter looked less like a man who had slept beside a wounded dog and more like a ghost still refusing to leave the battlefield. The rain over Coronado had eased into a thin silver drizzle, but the base remained soaked, every roofline dripping, every walkway shining under the pale winter light. In the veterinary recovery room, Ranger lay on his padded mat beneath a thermal blanket, his front paws tucked close to his chest, his amber eyes half open whenever Mason shifted beside him. The medication had softened his pain, but not his awareness. That was the cruelest mercy of all. Ranger still knew Mason was there. He still tried to lift his head when Mason stood. He still watched the door as if expecting a mission to begin. Dr. Laura Mitchell came in before sunrise, checked Ranger's pupils, pulse, and rear limb response, then wrote notes on her clipboard with the careful expression of a woman trying not to let compassion overrule truth. When she tested the hind paws, Ranger barely reacted. Not nothing, but close enough to nothing that the room seemed to shrink around Mason. "He's stable," Laura said quietly. "But stable is not the same as improving." Mason nodded, though the words landed somewhere deeper than language. He had spent the night counting Ranger's breaths, then losing count, then starting over again as if numbers could become prayer. Ben Turner arrived with coffee in 2 paper cups, his short beard darker from the damp air, his eyes red from lack of sleep he would never admit to. "You need to eat," Ben said, setting 1 cup beside Mason. Mason did not touch it. "He hasn't quit," Mason replied. Ben looked at Ranger, then back at Mason. "I know, but neither did a lot of good men before their bodies gave out." The words were not cruel. That made them hurt more. Dr. Laura asked Mason to step out for a few minutes while they adjusted Ranger's bedding and checked for pressure points. Mason resisted at first, his hand still resting on Ranger's neck, but Laura's voice held the quiet authority of someone who had carried too many animals through pain to be argued with. 5 minutes, she said. "Let us work. He'll still hear you outside." Mason walked out into the corridor with the coffee untouched in his hand. He did not know where he meant to go. His boots simply carried him past the veterinary unit, across the covered walkway, and toward the rehabilitation wing attached to the medical training center. He had passed that building 100 times before without looking in. It was a place for men who had come home with pieces of themselves missing, knees rebuilt with screws, shoulders torn by blast waves, backs damaged by bad landings, souls hidden behind jokes and silence. That morning, through a glass wall fogged slightly by the damp air, Mason saw a wounded operator suspended in a bodyweight support harness, his hands gripping parallel bars while a therapist guided his legs through slow, painful steps. The operator was young, maybe 29, with a lean face, sandy blonde hair cut close at the sides, and a pale scar running from the corner of his jaw down beneath his collar. His name patch read Hayes. Beside him stood Lieutenant Commander Rachel Evans, the lead physical therapist on base, a 40-year-old woman with warm brown skin, compact, muscular build, dark, curly hair pulled into a low bun, and the calm, commanding patience of someone who could convince broken men to try one more step when pride had already quit. Rachel had a reputation for being gentle until gentleness failed, then stubborn enough to move mountains with a clipboard. "Don't let the harness do all the believing for you, Hayes," she said. "Shift your weight. Let your body remember." The phrase struck Mason with such force that he stopped walking. Let your body remember. Hayes grimaced, sweat shining at his temples, one leg trembling badly as the overhead straps carried part of his weight. He took half a step, nearly buckled, cursed under his breath, then tried again. The harness did not heal him. It did not perform the miracle for him. It simply kept him from falling long enough to practice being whole. Mason moved closer to the glass. In the next station, another injured service member used resistance bands around his hips while a therapist adjusted tension. Farther back, a low metal frame supported a man learning to stand after spinal trauma. the machine reducing just enough load for his legs to fire without collapsing. Mason's mind, dulled by grief and sleeplessness, suddenly sharpened. He saw Ranger's body on the recovery pad. He saw the limp hind legs. He saw the way Ranger's front paws had scraped the concrete after the fall, desperate to rise. Then he saw the harness around Hayes, the adjustable straps, the careful distribution of weight, the measured way human weakness was not condemned, but supported. The thought came quietly at first, almost absurd, like a child whispering in a room full of experts. If a man could be held upright until his nerves and muscles remembered how to speak to each other, why not Ranger? Not to make him operational again. Not to send him back through smoke, rain, and steel, just to give him a chance to stand, to breathe without his body crushing itself, to live as more than a patient waiting for mercy. Mason entered the rehab room before he realized he had decided to. Rachel Evans looked up from Hayes's harness. She knew Mason by reputation, as most people on base did, and her eyes softened when she saw the hollow exhaustion on his face. "Carter," she said, "you're a long way from the K-9 unit." Mason looked at the support frame, then at the overhead track system. "How much weight can these rigs carry?" Rachel blinked once. "Depends on the rig. Could the principal work for a dog?" Hayes, still suspended, turned his head. "A dog?" Mason swallowed. "German Shepherd, 90 pounds, spinal swelling, rear leg paralysis." Rachel studied him then, not like a therapist hearing a strange question, but like a person recognizing a man standing at the edge of a cliff and building a bridge out of desperation. She did not answer quickly. That gave Mason more hope than an easy yes would have. "In theory," she said slowly, "body weight support is body weight support. But animal anatomy is different. Load points matter. Pressure over the abdomen, hips, chest, spine. If you get it wrong, you could hurt him worse. If we get it right," Rachel glanced toward the veterinary building through the rain-streaked window, "then maybe you buy him time to activate what's still there. Buy time." Mason carried those words back like fire stolen from some guarded altar. For the first time since Ranger had fallen, his grief had direction. He found an empty maintenance room near the K-9 training office, pulled a whiteboard from the wall, and began sketching. At first, the lines were rough, almost frantic. A low, rectangular steel frame, adjustable vertical posts, padded belly sling, rear hip support, chest stabilization, side straps, elastic resistance bands to prevent sudden collapse. Then the soldier in him took over. He measured Ranger's length from memory, shoulder height, chest depth, weight distribution. He listed risks: spinal pressure, skin breakdown, panic response, circulation, overexertion. He drew arrows showing how the load could be gradually shifted, how the harness could carry enough weight for Ranger to practice without forcing his damaged rear limbs to bear everything at once. Ben found him there an hour later, the untouched coffee cold on a toolbox. "Mace," he said, staring at the board, "what the hell is this?" Mason did not look away from the drawing. A way to keep him from dying on a mat. Ben's face tightened. Or a way to make his last days harder because you can't let go. That landed like a punch, and for a moment the room went silent except for the buzz of fluorescent lights. Mason turned then, his gray-blue eyes raw but steady. "You think I don't know that?" Ben looked down, ashamed of the sharpness in his own voice. "I think you love him, and I think love can get dangerous when it starts arguing with pain." "He still has something," Mason said. Laura said minimal reflex. Minimal isn't nothing. Before Ben could answer, Dr. Laura stepped into the doorway. Rachel Evans stood behind her, having apparently followed the chain of concern back to its source. Laura's auburn hair had loosened slightly from its knot, and her tired green eyes moved across the whiteboard with immediate professional caution. "Mason," she said, "this is not a field repair. I know. If pressure is placed wrong, it could worsen swelling. If he panics, he could twist. If we push too soon, we could turn discomfort into suffering. Then tell me how not to." Laura opened her mouth, but no answer came. She looked at the sketch again, at the notes, at the load points Mason had marked with almost painful care. Rachel stepped closer and added one line beneath the hip support with a black marker. "The lift needs to come from under the pelvis and chest, not the spine," she said. Laura looked at her sharply. Rachel shrugged. He asked how not to hurt him. Ben stared between them, hope and dread fighting across his face. Mason set the marker down slowly, as if any sudden movement might scare the fragile thing that had entered the room. "I'm not asking him to be what he was," Mason said. "I'm asking for a chance to help him remember how to stand." Laura's expression changed then, not into agreement, not yet, but into something less closed. She saw the danger, she saw the grief, but she also saw the difference between a man refusing reality and a man trying to build one last honest possibility from it. In the whiteboard's harsh light, surrounded by tools, cold coffee, and a desperate drawing, Mason no longer looked like a seal defying a verdict out of pride. He looked like a man holding the final match in a room nearly swallowed by darkness, shielding its flame with both hands. The recovery room had never felt so much like a battlefield. By late afternoon, the rain outside had thickened again, tapping against the high windows in nervous little bursts, while inside the veterinary unit every sound seemed too loud. The metallic click of buckles, the whisper of nylon straps sliding through steel loops, the low hum of the heater pushing warm air into a room that still felt cold. Mason Carter stood beside the support frame as if studying an enemy position before a raid. The structure was simple at first glance, a low steel frame built from reinforced training equipment, 4 adjustable posts, a padded chest sling, a wider belly band, and a rear support cradle designed to lift Ranger's hips without pressing directly against his spine. But to Mason, every bolt carried a prayer. Every strap was a promise. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, one of the base maintenance technicians, crouched near the left support post with a wrench in his broad hand. Marcus was 51, heavy-set but powerful, with deep brown skin, a shaved head, and a thick gray mustache that made him look stern until he smiled. He had spent 26 years fixing things men broke under pressure: boats, doors, engines, weapons racks, training rigs, and, sometimes quietly, the confidence of younger sailors who thought failure made them useless. Beside him worked Petty Officer Nina Alvarez, a compact woman in her early 30s with olive skin, sharp dark eyes, and black hair braided tightly down her back. Nina rarely wasted words. She had the steady hands of someone who had grown up repairing her father's fishing boats before joining the Navy, and she treated machinery with the same respect Dr. Laura gave living bodies. Nothing forced, nothing rushed, nothing ignored. Rachel Evans stood near the frame with a notepad in one hand, checking the strap angles one final time while Dr. Laura Mitchell moved between the equipment and Ranger's padded mat, her green eyes missing nothing. Ben Turner leaned against the wall near the door, arms folded, jaw tight beneath his short beard. He wanted to believe. Mason could see that. But Ben's fear stood beside him like a second man. Ranger lay quietly on the mat, his black and tan coat brushed dry except along his neck, where the fur still curled from earlier sweat and stress. His ears twitched at every movement. His amber eyes followed Mason with that same unbearable trust, as if the whole strange assembly of steel, cloth, and worried humans was merely another mission they would face together. Mason knelt beside him and ran one hand along Ranger's cheek. "We're not asking for victory today," he whispered, "just a sign." Dr. Laura heard him, but did not interrupt. Her face was composed, professional, almost severe, yet her fingers lingered for a moment on Ranger's front paw before she stood. "Everyone listens carefully," she said. "If he shows distress beyond normal discomfort, we stop. If his breathing spikes too hard, we stop. If he panics, we stop. No heroics, no proving a point." Her eyes landed on Mason last. "Especially from you." Mason nodded. It cost him more than argument would have. Marcus and Nina moved the frame into position while Rachel guided the chest sling beneath Ranger's front half. The first challenge was not lifting him. It was touching him without making the injury worse. They used a sliding board, folded blankets, and slow coordinated movements. Ranger gave one soft whine when the rear cradle passed under his hips, and Mason felt the sound pass through his ribs like a blade. His hand tightened, then relaxed, because Ranger did not need panic from him. He needed steadiness. "Easy, boy," Ben murmured from the wall, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "Easy, Ranger." Nina adjusted the belly band by half an inch and looked to Doctor Laura for approval. Laura checked the pressure points, then nodded. Marcus locked the right post. Rachel lowered the side straps until they took a whisper of Ranger's weight, not enough to lift, only enough to introduce the sensation. Ranger's front paws pressed against the mat. His rear legs hung loose, lifeless and terrible beneath him. Mason swallowed hard, remembering those same legs launching over barriers, digging into sand, sprinting through smoke during the night drills. Now they looked like forgotten flags after a storm. "Begin the lift," Dr. Laura said. Marcus turned the hand crank one slow rotation. The straps tightened. Ranger's body rose no more than an inch. His breathing changed immediately, faster, uncertain. Mason lowered himself in front of the dog until their eyes were level. "Look at me," he said softly. Ranger's gaze locked onto his. Another rotation, then another. The support system accepted more of Ranger's weight, raising his chest first, then his hips, until his paws brushed the padded floor beneath him. He was not standing. Not really. He was suspended in the idea of standing, held between memory and loss. His front legs trembled and tried to push. His back legs dangled, motionless. Ben looked away. Rachel's pencil stopped moving. Dr. Laura lifted a hand, ready to halt the whole attempt. Mason pressed both palms gently against Ranger's head, thumbs resting beneath the dog's ears the way he used to do after long missions when neither of them could sleep. "Stay with me, buddy," he whispered. "Just stay with me." For several seconds, nothing happened. The room held its breath. Ranger panted, eyes bright, body shaking not from strength but from the terror of not understanding what had become of him. Then his front paws scraped forward, claws catching the mat. He tried to rise into the harness, tried to help the lift instead of surrendering to it. "That's good," Rachel said under her breath. "That's voluntary effort in the front." Mason did not answer. He was watching the rear left paw. At first he thought he imagined it. Grief could make men see movement where there was none. Hope was a cruel magician when it wanted to be, but then it happened again. One toe curled, barely, a tiny inward pull, weak as a candle flame in a storm. Mason froze. "Laura," he said, his voice almost gone. Dr. Laura was already moving. She crouched beside Ranger's hind leg, touched the paw lightly, then applied a careful stimulus along the pad. For one dead second there was nothing. Then the paw twitched again. Not a kick, not a step, not salvation, but a response. Dr. Laura's expression changed so quickly and so quietly that only Mason, watching her like his life depended on it, saw the verdict shift behind her eyes. "Again," she said. Nina steadied the rear cradle. Marcus stopped breathing with the wrench still in his hand. Laura tested the other paw. Ranger's right rear leg trembled faintly near the hock, almost invisible beneath the fur. Ben pushed off the wall and took one step forward. "Tell me that's what I think it is," he said. Dr. Laura did not smile. She was too careful for that. But when she looked up at Mason, her voice had lost the finality it carried the day before. "There is still reflex activity. It's weak, but it's present." Mason closed his eyes for a moment, and the room blurred into rain, steel, breath, and mercy. He wanted to shout. He wanted to collapse. Instead, he leaned his forehead against Ranger's and let one silent tear fall into the dog's fur. Ranger, exhausted by the effort, gave a small huff and tried once more to push with his front legs, as if the praise in the room had reached something deep inside him. Dr. Laura ordered the lift reduced. "That's enough. We end on this." "No more today." Mason wanted to ask for another try, another sign, another miracle large enough to silence every fear, but he heard Laura's warning inside his skull, no heroics, so he nodded. Marcus eased the crank backward. The straps loosened. Ranger was lowered slowly onto the padded mat, his body trembling, his eyes still fixed on Mason as though asking whether he had done well. Mason cupped his face in both hands. "You did perfect," he whispered. "You hear me? Perfect." Ben turned away, wiping at his cheek with the heel of his hand and pretending to cough. Rachel wrote the result down, but her handwriting shook just enough to betray her. Nina quietly touched the steel frame, as if blessing a machine that had just become something more than metal. Dr. Laura checked Ranger's pulse, gums, breathing, and pain response, then sat back on her heels. "This does not mean recovery," she said, because truth was still her duty. "It means we have a reason to continue." In the cold recovery room, beneath fluorescent lights and storm-dark windows, that was enough. Not a cure, not a promise, just one curled toe, one trembling response, one small rebellion against the sentence waiting outside the door. Hope returned carefully, humbly, like a match struck in fog. Hope did not arrive like a trumpet blast. It arrived like a wounded thing that had to be fed carefully, protected from wind, and forgiven for being small. In the weeks after Ranger's first faint reflex, the recovery room became Mason Carter's second home, and sometimes, in the gray hours before dawn, it felt more honest than any barracks, office, or chapel on base. The support frame stood in the center of the room like a strange steel altar, its padded slings adjusted and readjusted until Marcus Reed joked that Ranger had better appreciate custom engineering because half the Navy seemed to be tailoring him a suit. The joke earned a tired smile from Ben Turner and nothing from Mason, though later, when no one was looking, Mason touched the frame and whispered, "You hear that, buddy? Fancy gear. Try not to look too impressed." Ranger did not look impressed. He looked exhausted. His once powerful black and tan body had begun to change in ways that made Mason's chest ache. The hips sharper beneath the fur, the rear legs thinner, the proud line of his back interrupted by weakness no amount of courage could hide. Some mornings Ranger lifted his head when Mason entered, ears twitching with faint recognition. Other mornings he only opened one amber eye, as if the world had grown too heavy to greet. Dr. Laura Mitchell kept the therapy schedule strict. Short lift sessions, careful rest, nerve checks, assisted stretching, hydration, pain monitoring, skin inspection, and no foolish attempts to chase dramatic progress. "Recovery is not a raid," she reminded Mason more than once. "You don't storm it. You survive it." Mason hated that because it was true. In war, he had been trained to act, breach, move, clear, solve. But Ranger's body could not be ordered into healing. It had to be coaxed, and Mason was not a man who knew how to coax anything except a dog and a memory. The first week nearly broke them. Ranger trembled whenever the sling lifted him, not from fear of Mason, but from the strange helplessness of being held up by a machine. Twice he panicked and twisted his front half, forcing everyone to lower him immediately. Once he refused food for almost an entire day, turning away from chicken broth, softened kibble, even the small pieces of turkey Ben smuggled in with the solemn expression of a man committing treason for a noble cause. Ben, broad-shouldered and usually armed with a joke, sat beside Ranger that evening and sighed. "You know, I've seen SEALs act tough, but turning down turkey is next-level stubborn." Ranger gave one tired blink. Mason almost laughed, and the almost laugh hurt more than crying would have. Rachel Evans continued advising from the human rehab side, helping adjust the support angles so Ranger's chest and pelvis carried weight evenly without pressure on the injured spine. Nina Alvarez replaced one strap with a softer marine-grade webbing and added quick-release buckles in case Ranger panicked again. Marcus welded a lower crossbar and patted every edge twice, muttering that if the dog got one scratch from his rig, he would personally court-martial himself. The team grew around Ranger without ceremony. No one called it love because military people often treated that word like contraband. But there it was all the same, hidden in tools, charts, towels, late coffee, and hands that moved gently over a dog built for war. Progress came in pieces so small they would have looked meaningless to anyone who had not been watching despair measure the room. A toe curled twice instead of once. A rear leg held tension for 3 seconds. Ranger stayed lifted for 45 seconds without panic. Then 1 minute. Then 2. He pushed with his front legs and did not collapse into the sling immediately. Doctor? Laura wrote each note in her careful hand, but Mason noticed the way her green eyes softened whenever the numbers improved. Still, there were bad days. Cruel days. Days when Ranger's body seemed to forget yesterday's victory and return to silence. On one stormy night, after a session ended with Ranger sagging heavily into the harness, Mason stayed behind long after the lights dimmed. He sat on the floor beside the mat, one hand buried in Ranger's neck fur, and finally spoke the name he had kept locked behind his teeth for 2 years. "Caleb Rhodes," he said softly. Ranger breathed against his wrist. Caleb had been Mason's teammate, 33 years old, tall and rangy, with the sun-browned skin, bright red hair he kept cropped short, and a crooked grin that made officers suspicious and children trust him instantly. He had been the kind of man who could make an entire team laugh in the back of a transport before a mission, then turn quiet as stone the moment boots hit dirt. Caleb had died during an extraction Mason still replayed in pieces. Dust, shouting, rotor wash, a hand slipping from his grip. 3 seconds too late. Mason had carried many things since then, but those 3 seconds had become a kingdom of ghosts. "I was late," Mason whispered to Ranger. "That's the part nobody can fix. Reports say I did what I could. Ben says it. Command said it. Even Caleb's father said it when I couldn't look him in the eye. But I know the truth. I was late." Ranger shifted his head with visible effort and placed his muzzle across Mason's hand. No speech, no absolution carved in gold, no thunder from heaven, just warmth, weight, breath, the ancient mercy of an animal who did not ask a man to win his past before allowing him to be loved. Mason bent over him, shoulders shaking once, then again, silent as collapsing snow. After that night, Mason began talking more, not to everyone, not all at once. But to Ranger, during stretches, during feedings, during the long minutes when the sling held the dog upright and the room trembled with patience. He told him about Caleb's bad singing, about the missions that still visited his sleep, about the fear that every creature he loved would eventually need him 1 second faster than he could move. Ranger answered with breath, with blinks, with small, stubborn efforts that seemed almost timed to Mason's confessions. A half-minute longer in the frame, a faint pull of the right leg. A day when he accepted food from Mason's palm after refusing the bowl. Ben noticed the change before Mason did. "You're different," he said one afternoon while tightening a side strap. Mason kept his eyes on Ranger. "He's the one healing." Ben shook his head. "Yeah, that's what I said." By the end of the 3rd week, Ranger could remain supported for several minutes without panic. His rear legs still trembled, still failed, still betrayed him often enough to keep pride from entering the room too early. But they were no longer completely silent. Dr. Laura adjusted the plan, not with promises, but with permission to continue. Mason accepted that as if she had handed him water in a desert. That evening, as rain cleared and a pale strip of sunset opened beyond the high windows, Ranger rested after therapy with his muzzle on Mason's palm. Mason did not ask him to stand. He did not ask him to fight harder. For once, he only sat there, breathing with him, understanding something he had missed for years. Forgiveness was not always spoken by the living or granted by the dead. Sometimes it came quietly, through the steady breathing of a wounded dog who stayed beside you anyway. The storm returned before sunrise, not as mist this time, but as a hard coastal rain that struck the windows like thrown gravel, turning the recovery room into a small island of light surrounded by gray water and thunder. Mason Carter had been awake long before the first alarm on base sounded. He sat beside Ranger's mat with his back against the wall, one hand resting lightly over the German shepherd's shoulder, feeling each breath rise beneath the thinning, black and tan fur. Ranger had survived weeks that would have humbled any living creature. The pen, the exhaustion, the strange indignity of being lifted by straps when he had once flown over obstacles with the pride of a king. Yet, that morning, there was something different in the room, something no one named. Dr. Laura Mitchell arrived carrying Ranger's latest notes, her auburn hair tied tighter than usual, her pale, freckled face composed but tired around the eyes. She checked Ranger's gums, pulse, spine sensitivity, rear leg tone, then stood silently at the end of the mat longer than Mason liked. Ben Turner came in next, Rain still clinging to his shaved head and shoulders, his short beard damp, his usual humor absent. Rachel Evans followed with the therapy chart, calm but watchful, while Marcus Reed and Nina Alvarez inspected the frame one more time as if preparing a bridge before a wounded army crossed it. "We need to talk before we lift him," Dr. Laura said. Mason looked up slowly. He already knew that tone. It was the same tone commanders used before bad weather became a failed mission, before hope was reduced to procedure. "His body is tired," Laura continued. "He has shown improvement, but not enough weight-bearing yet. If he cannot support even part of himself today, we have to ask whether the sessions are helping him or simply draining what strength he has left." Ben lowered his eyes. Rachel pressed her lips together. No one moved. Mason looked at Ranger, who was awake now, amber eyes fixed on him, ears weakly angled forward. The dog did not know about medical thresholds or decisions made in sorrowful rooms. He only knew Mason was there. "So this is the line," Mason said. Laura's voice softened. "It may be. Not because we're giving up, Mason. Because love also has to know when pain is winning." Mason wanted to argue. The old Mason would have. The man from Chapter 1, the man who believed endurance alone could wrestle fate into submission, would have turned grief into orders. But the weeks beside Ranger had changed him. He had learned that healing was not conquered. It was invited. So he only nodded, though his throat tightened until breathing felt like swallowing stone. They began carefully. Nina checked each buckle. Marcus adjusted the rear support cradle by half an inch. Rachel guided the chest sling under Ranger, murmuring instructions in the same low voice she used with injured men learning to trust their bodies again. Ben stood opposite Mason, hands ready, face pale beneath his brown skin. Ranger gave a soft breath as the straps tightened. Mason knelt in front of him, close enough for Ranger to see nothing but his face. "No pressure, buddy," he whispered, though every soul in the room knew that was a lie. The crank turned. The harness lifted. Ranger's chest rose first, then his hips, until his paws brushed the padded floor. His front legs found the mat and trembled. His rear legs hung, then twitched, then stiffened in a shudder that ran through his whole body. Rachel watched the load meter. "He's taking a little through the front," she said. "Very little through the rear." Laura nodded once. "Loosen the support 5%. Marcus obeyed. The straps eased. Ranger's body sank slightly, and his rear legs shook violently beneath him. Mason saw the effort flash across the dog's face. Not in words, not in expression as humans understood it, but in the raw tightening of the jaw, the desperate focus of the eyes. Ranger was trying to reach something inside himself, some lost command buried beneath swelling, pain, and weeks of helplessness. "Easy," Mason said. "I'm here." Another 5%. Ranger sagged. Ben stepped forward by instinct, but Laura lifted a hand. "Wait!" Ranger's front claws scraped against the mat. His rear left paw slid outward. His hips dipped. The harness caught him before he fell completely, but the room heard the failure anyway. It had a sound. Nylon straining, breath breaking, hope flinching. Laura's face tightened. Stop! Bring him back up. Mason's hand moved toward Ranger before he could stop himself. One more second. Mason, Laura warned. He's spent. One more second, he repeated, but this time his voice broke. Ben turned his face away, jaw clenched so hard the muscle jumped near his ear. Rachel looked down at the chart, blinking too quickly. Marcus froze at the crank. Nina's fingers hovered near the quick-release buckle. It was ending. Everyone felt it. Ranger's rear legs trembled beneath him, useless and heartbreaking. Mason leaned close, prepared to take the weight, to tell Laura she was right, to do the loving thing even if it split him open. Then Ranger lifted his head. It was not much, just a slow, stubborn rise of the muzzle, but Mason stopped. The dog's amber eyes locked onto him with a clarity that seemed almost impossible after so much exhaustion. For a moment, the recovery room disappeared. There was no storm, no frame, no verdict, no watching faces. There was only Mason and Ranger, as they had been on dark roads, in silent barracks rooms, in the long after-war where both had learned to survive by breathing near each other. Ranger pulled air deep into his chest. His front legs drove down. The movement was sudden enough that Ben whispered, "Oh, God." Ranger's shoulders rose against the harness. His rear left paw, the one that had curled weeks before like a candle flame, dragged forward across the mat. It was ugly, crooked, almost accidental, but it moved. Then, before anyone dared breathe, the right rear paw shifted too, sliding half a step beneath his body. Ranger buckled instantly, the harness catching most of him, but his legs had not simply twitched. They had followed, not well, not strongly, but willingly. Mason stared as if the floor had opened and shown him mercy underneath. "Did he just—" Ben began, but his voice failed. Ranger pushed again, weaker this time, and managed one broken forward motion, his body shaking so hard the straps rattled. Laura covered her mouth with one hand. Rachel's eyes filled. Marcus let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Nina whispered something in Spanish under her breath, soft as a prayer. Mason did not remember standing, only that suddenly his hands were on Ranger's face, his own tears falling freely into the dog's fur. He had cried in silence before, cried alone where no one could witness the wreckage, but not like this. Not in front of Ben, Laura, Rachel, Marcus, Nina, not with his shoulders shaking and his voice gone. Ranger panted against him, exhausted, confused, still trying to stay upright because Mason was there and Mason had asked him to stay. "Lower him," Laura said at last, her voice trembling despite all her discipline. "Carefully. He's done enough." Marcus eased the lift. Ranger sank onto the padded mat, every muscle quivering, but his head remained turned toward Mason. Ben stepped closer, wiping his face with both hands now, no longer pretending the rain had followed him inside. He looked at the dog, then at Mason, and whispered, "He's still fighting." No one corrected him. No one needed to. "Doctor?" Laura checked Ranger quickly, professionally, but her hands were gentler than ever. "This changes the plan," she said. "Not the risks, not the work ahead, but it changes the plan." Mason sat on the floor beside Ranger, breathing hard, one hand over the dog's chest, feeling the thunderous little rhythm of life still refusing surrender. In that room, Ranger was no longer merely a patient waiting for mercy. He was not healed, not safe, not guaranteed anything, but he had crossed a line no diagnosis could erase. He had taken a step, broken and trembling, yet real enough to shatter every heart that had been preparing to say goodbye. He was a warrior coming back. Spring did not arrive in Coronado with trumpets, only with warmer wind, dry pavement, and sunlight returning gently to the training field where Ranger had once fallen. Months had passed since that rain-soaked morning in the recovery room when one broken step had shattered everyone who saw it. The support frame still stood in the corner of the veterinary unit, its steel polished from use, its straps softened by hands that had adjusted them 1,000 times, but Ranger no longer needed it. Not every day. not for ordinary walking. The 4-year-old German shepherd moved slowly now, his black and tan coat full again, his chest still proud, his amber eyes calmer than before, as if suffering had not stolen his spirit but deepened it. His gait was uneven, especially when he turned too quickly or stood too long, and his back legs sometimes trembled after a long morning. But when Ranger walked across the sunlit yard beside Mason Carter, head lifted, ears forward, there was no shame in him. There was only survival wearing the shape of dignity. Mason had changed too. The 36-year-old Navy SEAL still carried the same broad shoulders, the same short dark hair, the same carved jaw and storm-colored eyes, but something in his face had loosened. He no longer looked like a man braced for impact every second of the day. Some grief remained. Grief always did. It sat beside him like an old soldier who had earned the right to stay. But Mason no longer mistook pain for punishment. Ranger had taught him that healing could limp and still be holy. Dr. Laura Mitchell had officially retired Ranger from active operational duty 3 weeks earlier. She had said it gently, standing in the recovery room with her clipboard held against her chest, her auburn hair streaked with morning light, her green eyes steady but warm. "He has nothing left to prove," she told Mason. Mason had looked down at Ranger, who was sniffing Marcus Reed's toolbox with great professional suspicion, and nodded. "No," he said, "he doesn't." Ben Turner had been there too, arms crossed, short beard framing the kind of grin he tried to hide when emotion got too close. "Don't tell him he's retired," Ben said. "He'll start demanding benefits." Ranger sneezed at exactly the right moment, and even Dr. Laura laughed. It was the first time Mason remembered laughing in that room without feeling guilty afterward. Yet retirement did not mean Ranger was finished. A week later, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Evans asked Mason to visit a new mental recovery program for injured and traumatized operators. It was held in a quiet building near the medical wing, not far from the rehabilitation room where Mason had first seen bodyweight harnesses and found the impossible idea that saved Ranger. The program was designed for men who came home alive but not whole. SEALs and other special operators carrying blast memories, survivor's guilt, nightmares, silence, anger, and the strange loneliness of being congratulated for surviving something they could not stop reliving. Mason almost refused. He told Rachel he was not a counselor. Rachel, compact and steady as ever, her dark curls pulled back and her warm brown eyes far too perceptive, only looked at Ranger and said, "I wasn't asking you to be one." The first session took place on a bright morning that smelled of ocean salt and fresh coffee. 6 men sat in a loose circle inside the room, most of them pretending not to look at one another. Some had visible wounds. Others carried the invisible kind, which were often heavier because no one knew where to place a bandage. In the far corner sat Tyler Brooks, a 27-year-old SEAL with a lean, wiry build, pale skin, close-cropped blonde hair, and blue eyes fixed on the floor as if eye contact itself might detonate something inside him. He had a narrow face with sharp cheekbones and faint stubble along his jaw, not from style, but neglect. Before his failed mission, Tyler had been known as talkative, almost annoyingly cheerful, the kind of young operator who could make a team laugh during bad weather and worse orders. But after losing 2 men during an extraction overseas, he had stopped speaking except for the necessary words required by command. Even those came rarely. He sat with both hands clenched between his knees, shoulders folded inward, a young warrior trying to disappear inside his own body. Mason recognized the posture. He had worn it once, maybe he still did on certain nights. Ranger stood beside Mason at the doorway, calm but alert. His limp was visible as he crossed the threshold, each step measured, one rear paw dragging slightly before correcting. A few men glanced up, then quickly away. No one wanted to be moved by a dog. No one wanted to need anything soft. Ranger, being wiser than men, ignored their pride. He sniffed Rachel's shoe, accepted a brief touch from Ben, then slowly made his way around the room. He did not rush toward Tyler. He visited each man as if checking a perimeter, gentle, patient, asking nothing. When he finally reached the corner, Tyler stiffened. Mason nearly called Ranger back, but Rachel lifted one hand slightly, stopping him. Ranger stood before Tyler for a long moment, amber eyes lifted, ears relaxed. Then, with the same solemn tenderness he had once shown Mason in a motel room after a nightmare, Ranger stepped closer and rested his head on Tyler Brooks's knee. Tyler did not move. His fingers twitched. His breathing turned shallow. The room went silent, not the tense silence of orders, but the sacred silence that gathers when something true is about to break open. Ranger stayed still, warm and heavy and unafraid. Tyler's hand slowly rose, trembling, and touched the fur between Ranger's ears. The young seal's face twisted as if he were trying to hold back the ocean with his teeth. Then his shoulders shook. A sound escaped him, raw and wounded, almost animal. He bent over Ranger and began to cry. Not politely, not quietly. He cried like a man whose locked room had finally found a door. Mason stood near the entrance, unable to move. He saw Caleb Rhodes in his memory, saw Ranger on the concrete, saw the support frame, saw every small step that had led here. Ben bowed his head. Rachel blinked back tears. No one spoke until Tyler did. His voice came broken and hoarse, unused for months. "I couldn't get them out," he whispered. Ranger only breathed against him. Mason understood then, with a force that nearly took his knees. Ranger had not lost his mission. The mission had changed. Once he had tracked scent through rain, smoke, and rubble. Now he tracked the places where men had hidden their pain so deeply, even they could no longer find it. He found them anyway. He went to the corner, placed his wounded body beside theirs, and showed them that broken did not mean finished. Later, when the session ended, Ranger walked back to Mason with his uneven step and his head held high. Mason knelt and pressed his forehead to the dog's. "You did it again," he whispered. Ranger's tail moved once, slow and proud. Outside, the training field shone beneath the California sun. The place where Ranger had fallen was dry now, ordinary again, but Mason would never see it as ordinary. It was the ground where one life seemed to end and another began. People often said Navy SEALs did not leave their brothers behind. Mason had proven it for a brother with 4 legs. And Ranger, the warrior once sentenced by injury and silence, had returned not to war but to mercy. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive with thunder in the sky or a bright light breaking through the clouds. Sometimes a miracle comes quietly, in one trembling step, one loyal heartbeat, one tired hand refusing to let go. Ranger's story reminds us that God's grace often moves through ordinary moments. A friend who stays beside us, a small act of courage, a love that refuses to surrender even when the world says there is no hope left. In our daily lives, we may not be soldiers on a battlefield, but we all face days when something inside us feels broken, when we wonder if we can ever stand again. And maybe the lesson is this: falling is not the end of the story. Pain is not the final chapter. With faith, patience, and love, even a wounded heart can rise again. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, healing, and the quiet miracles that remind us we are never truly alone. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your days with courage, kindness, and peace.